This is Flare and Flow by The Legend of Chel on AO3. Chapter 9, Ignite. Hey, you changed your hair back. Keith looked up to see Lance enter the room. His hand drifted up to touch his now black hair. Oh, yeah, Keith replied. Now that Lotar called off the bounty, there wasn't much reason to keep the disguise. The prince had indeed kept his word, and the numerous wanted posters vanished almost overnight. Keith still kept his guard up when he went out, but in the past few days since rescuing Cheryl, no one bothered him. Lance sat down next to Keith. Keith tried not to feel self-conscious as the waterbender's eyes swept over him. In addition to his hair, Keith had also replaced the Airbender ensemble with his old Fire Nation outfit. I gotta say, the white hair was a good look, but Lance shot him a grin. This is definitely more you. Red is totally your color. Keith smiled back. Feels more like me, he said. The Airbender robes were light and flexible, but Keith felt much more comfortable in his own clothes. Still got this, I see. Lance reached up and playfully tweaked at the hairband holding Keith's ponytail. Keith smirked. Well, it holds sentimental value. Oh? Lance shifted closer. Yeah. Keith shrugged with feigned nonchalance. I can't quite remember why, though. The hand playing with his ponytail traveled downward, nails slightly scratching against his scalp as Lance's other hand snaked around his waist. Maybe I can help you? And how do you propose to do that? Keith scooted closer as well and brought his own hand to fiddle coyly with the tassels on the front of Lance's tunic. I've a few ideas. Lance's lips brushed against his own. Knock, knock. The two sprang apart as Shiro poked his head through the door. Hey, Keith, Oh. Shiro glanced between the red-faced benders and raised an eyebrow. Did I interrupt something? Nope, Lance replied too loudly as he jumped up and walked past Shiro, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Good talk. See you later, Keith. Lance watched with bemusement as the waterbender disappeared down the hall. He turned back to look at his brother. Shut up, Keith scowled, his face still matching the crimson of his tunic. I didn't say anything. Shiro sat down in the spot Lance had just vacated. As Keith tried to will away his bust, he saw Shiro side-eyeing him out of the corner of his eye. He seems nice. Keith felt the heat return to his cheeks at full force. Shut up, he repeated. Shiro chuckled, only to cut himself off as he clutched at his side with a wince. All thoughts of his own embarrassment vanished, and Keith turned his full attention to his brother. Are you okay? Do you need me to get the doctor? He asked worriedly. Shiro shook his head. Laughing just agitated my ribs a bit is all, he assured him. Keith swept his eyes over Shiro obsessively. Apart from his arm in a sling and the bandage across his nose, Shiro looked like he was in pretty good condition. But Keith knew he was hiding multiple bruises under his clothes. The doctor had assured them there was no lasting damage, though, and that with time and rest, Shiro would make a full recovery. He wouldn't be able to firebend very well until his arm healed, but Keith was confident that the rest of them could protect him until then, if need be. So, Shiro said after the pain had passed, when you told me about your recent adventures, you neglected to mention you'd gotten a boyfriend. Shiro waggled his eyebrows a bit. Keith almost wished Shiro was in pain again. Almost. I don't know if I'd call him my boyfriend, Keith finally said after a stretch of silence. We've really only been on one date. Do you like him? Keith nodded shyly. Then that's all that matters. Shiro ruffled Keith's hair, drawing an indignant squawk. Pouting, Keith tried to pat his hair back into some semblance of order. I still can't believe my little brother is the Avatar. It's taken some getting used to, Keith admitted. Even now, it feels like too much sometimes. Just getting you back was a huge undertaking, and now Alora's asking me to find the White Line when no one's been able to for years. I want to help, of course, but what if I can't? Shiro placed his uninjured hand on Keith's shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. You can, Keith. I know it. You've always been one of the most talented and resourceful people I've ever met, and you've never been afraid to tackle each new challenge that life throws at you. And this time, you're not alone. The friends you made will stand with you, and you know I'll always be there to support you too. I know, Keith smiled. Thanks, Shiro. That does actually make me feel a lot better. Anytime. The two brothers smiled at each other in companionable silence for a moment before Keith cleared his throat. Anyway, enough about me. You still haven't told me how you ended up as Lotar's prisoner. What happened after we split up the night we escaped the Fire Nation? Shiro shrugged and ran a hand through his hair with a sheepish grin. Honestly, there is not a lot to tell. My trip wasn't as nearly as eventful as yours, at least not until the end. After I managed to lose the guards, I had to lay low for a while. When I finally escaped the capital, I set off on my own towards Ba Sing Se. From what you've told me, you guys took a less direct route than I did, which is probably why I still got there first. Keith nodded. Even discounting their detour from when he had been kidnapped, the group's travel plan had been slightly more scenic than practical, and Lance frequently insisted they stop to appreciate the view or enjoy their road trip. Check out that mysterious cave. Come on, guys, it'll be fun. It had annoyed Keith to no end, but they never went so far out of the way to warrant Keith leaving. I arrived in Ba Sing Se about a week before you rescued me. Shiro grimaced. I'll admit, I wasn't in the best condition. I'd been on the road for months and hadn't seen any signs of Lotor's men since crossing the border, so I let my guard down. Needless to say, as soon as I stepped foot into Sam's office, they grabbed me. I'm sorry, Shiro, Keith said. If I just gotten there a couple days earlier. Shiro shook his head. Don't blame yourself, Keith. If anything, I'm glad you weren't there. Who knows what would have happened? His brother smirked. You probably would have blown up the university, and then we'd be at war with the Earth Kingdom. Keith rolled his eyes. I'm not that bad, he griped, though his lower lip quirked with mirth. Besides, I'm pretty sure as the Avatar I get diplomatic immunity or something. I don't think that's how that works. Keith shrugged, and the two grinned at each other. After a moment, Keith reached over to hug his brother. The bridge of his nose prickled, and Keith squeezed his eyes shut against the tears. I'm glad you're okay, Shiro, he mumbled into the fabric of Shiro's shirt. I missed you. Shiro wrapped his arms around Keith in return. Me too, he said softly. You met the Red Lion? Alora repeated with wide eyes, her noodles temporarily forgotten. They were all eating dinner together when Keith revealed his news. Yeah, Keith nodded. When I astral projected, the Red Lion helped me. I think I might have summoned him by accident. He seemed to know what I was looking for, and he took me right to Shiro. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, though she looked more hurt than angry. Keith shrugged. Sorry, I was pretty preoccupied with rescuing Shiro as soon as possible. I didn't even think about it until now. I suppose it's understandable. That determined spark returned to Alora's eyes. But this is wonderful news. If you were able to summon the Red Lion, perhaps you can do so with the White Lion. I'll give it a shot, Keith said, but I think it was more the lion's choice to appear than anything I did. Well, it doesn't hurt to try, Alora agreed, returning to her food with renewed energy. That's so cool you met one of the lions, Hunk piped up. I've only heard about them in stories. Is it true they're as big as a sky bison? The red lion was bigger than an ostrich horse, but much smaller than a sky bison. Keith shook his head. It was in spirit form, though, so who knows if it's different in physical form. Nah, that sounds about right. Lance slurped his broth straight from the bowl, ignoring the disgusted looks Allura shot at him. The blue lion is about the size of a polar bear dog. You've seen the blue lion? Asked Pidge. Lance nodded. Yeah, my great uncle is the chief of the Northern Water Tribe. We're not that close since my family lives out in the city, but we visit from time to time. I only got to see the lion once, though. She, never leaves the inner sanctum. Allura nodded sadly. There was a time when the lions would freely roam amongst the people. They were an image of hope, just like the Avatar, she said. But something happened a few generations ago, and since then the rulers of the 4 nations have kept a much tighter leash on them, so to speak. It's only gotten worse when the white lion disappeared. Now anyone's lucky to see them. What happened to make them change like that? Asked Pidge. I'm not sure, Allura admitted. Much of the written history from that period of time was intentionally erased. All we know is that some great calamity occurred and the lions were almost destroyed. In order to protect them, the rulers locked them away and ordered the lions to never leave their side without permission. They can do that? Shiro asked. The lions have their own wills, but they form a contract of sorts with the ruler of each nation. A bond, if you will. The Airbender explained. The ruler cannot force a lion to go against its credo. For example, the lions cannot wage war against another nation as it contradicts their instinct to protect, but they can order them to do pretty much anything else, including hiding them away from the very people they watch over, concluded Pidge. Yes, that is why the Avatar is so important. She turned her gaze to Keith. Unlike the lions, you are not bound to a single nation. This means you have more responsibility, but also more freedom. You can choose where to place your loyalty. Huh. I like the sound of that. Keith smiled. Allura returned to returned the smile briefly before it slipped away. My father, the current leader of the Aeronomats, was much less strict with the White Lion than his predecessors. He allowed her to interact with our people fairly often. Of course, her eyes darkened. When she disappeared, many blamed my father for giving her too much leeway. The table grew silent, everyone's mood dropping in sympathy. After a moment, Hunk interjected once more. Hey, I have a question. Why are the lions lions? The others blinked back at the Earthbender. I'm not sure I understand the question, Allura said hesitantly. Well, Hunk counted off his fingers. You've got ostrich horses, and Lancers mentioned polar bear dogs, and of course the elements themselves came from the ancient lion turtles, but Hunk looked up to meet their baffled expressions. Why are the lion spirits just lions? I never really thought about it, Lance said. I just assumed it was because they were super special guardian spirits, and that made them unique. There is this one legend, Corinne offered, that suggests the lions were once all part of the same enormous, powerful entity, but split up into four beings to protect the individual groups of people when the four nations formed. The entity was still a lion, though, just a really big one, so I suppose that doesn't actually help that all that much. Yeah, that's pretty cool, but doesn't really answer my question. Hunk paused. If anything, it gives me more questions. Well, as fascinating as this is to think about, I believe that is... Oh. Well, as fascinating as this is to think about, I believe that is for now what... I believe that for now we should focus on locating the white lion, Allura said. Keith, once you're done eating, we'll go and meditate. We can go now. Keith took the last bite of his dinner and got up to follow Allura to their rooms. Despite his and Allura's best attempts to recreate that night, Keith was unable to summon the white lion, or any lion for that matter. After a few days of trying different methods, Allura let out a frustrated sigh. Are you sure you're concentrating properly? She asked. Keith scowled. Yes, for the last time. Just focus on what the red lion's aura felt like. That's what I've been trying to do this whole time. Keith threw his hands in the air. I know you're some kind of spirit prodigy, but reading auras is new to me. I can't memorize a sentence in a language I don't understand. Keith paused. Well, I could, but I still wouldn't know what it means. Look, my point is that a lot was going on that night, and while I'm sure I could recognize a lion's aura if I saw it, it's a lot harder to recreate in my head out of nothing, okay? I'm sorry. To his surprise, Allura's tired eyes lit up. That's it, she exclaimed. Perhaps if you met with one of the other lions, you could use a physical connection to amplify your spiritual one. You mean Keith tilted his head, meditate with one of the lions in the same room or something? Exactly, Allura beamed. I'm sure they'd be willing to help if you asked. But the only lion close to us is the green lion of Earth, and Queen Sonda is notoriously paranoid about letting anyone see him. Allura's smile slipped away. Yes, that's true. But, she eyed him hesitantly, she might make an exception for the Avatar? Keith stared down at his hands clasped in his lap. His talk with Shiro the other day had helped, but he still wasn't sure he was ready. He had accepted his role as the Avatar and was prepared to dedicate his life to helping the world, but going public was a whole different matter. Keith didn't do well with crowds or speeches or anything like that, and he knew those kinds of things would be expected of him. If protecting the world from the shadows was an option, Keith would have taken it in a heartbeat. But Keith knew that wasn't realistic. The Avatar wasn't just someone who saved people, but a symbol of peace, and symbols didn't do any good if no one could see them. Besides, it was only a matter of time anyway, after his battle with Lotor. Between the prince's men and the hired earthbenders, there had been plenty of witnesses, and rumors of a new Avatar had already begun to spread. He was thankful for the time his friends had given him to adjust, but he couldn't hide from the world forever. Lotor was right about one thing. When presented with a challenge, Keith always preferred to face it head-on. Decision made, Keith raised his eyes to meet Allura's. Let's go talk to the Earth Queen. The next day, Allura and Keith went to the Earth Palace. The others had wanted to tag along, and honestly, Keith would have felt a bit more confident with them there to back him up if things went awry, but Allura disagreed. She was the only one who had met Queen Sonda before, and was adamant that a larger group would make her less willing to talk. As a high-ranking airbender, Allura was able to get them access to the palace grounds and led the way to the throne room. Dozens of Earth Kingdom citizens from all different social classes bustled to and fro, servants attending to their duties, soldiers patrolling the halls, aristocrats strolling through the gardens. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to be, and Keith had to jump out of the way of a frantic busybody more than once. Finally, Keith and Allura found themselves in front of two large doors with a royal guard posted on either side. Allura drew herself up to full height. "I am Airbender Allura, daughter of Alfor. I have important business with Queen Zonda," she announced with an air of confidence. The guards didn't budge. "The Queen isn't seeing anyone today." Allura frowned. "I sent a message earlier this morning to request a meeting. I'm sure she received it." "The Queen isn't seeing anyone today," he repeated. Allura visibly reined in her temper. "Please," she said calmly but firmly, "just tell her I'm here and that I brought the Avatar." His stoic expression broke as he and his companion stared at Keith. Keith tried his best to look important. The guards exchanged glances, and one slipped inside the room. After a few excruciating minutes, he returned. "Queen Zonda has agreed to grant you an audience." They moved forward, but the guard stopped Allura. "Not you," he nodded at Keith. "Just him." Keith shot her a mildly panicked look, but Allura placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You can do this," she assured him quietly. "Just keep in mind what we talked about. Remember, she may be the queen, but you are the Avatar. You have more power than you realize." Swallowing, Keith squared his shoulders and walked over the threshold. The throne room, like seemingly everything in the Earth Kingdom, was enormous. The ceiling was several stories high, and it took Keith what felt like an hour just to walk over to the figure seated on the other side. At a glance, if Keith had to describe Queen Zonda in one word, it would be stern. Everything from her rigid posture to the steely focus of her eyes suggested a strict and uncompromising nature. The rest of the room was empty, except for the large green lion that sat next to her throne. Keith took a second to look at him. The green lion of Earth was the first lion spirit he had seen in person. He was roughly the same size as the red lion had been, maybe a little bigger, and had an equally impressive mane, though where the red lion's mane resembled a halo of wildfire, the green lion's mane reminded Keith of tall grass gently swaying in the breeze. As he stared into the green lion's eyes, Keith felt a presence press against his mind, similar to when he met the red lion. It was odd, but strangely soothing. "So," Zonda barked, and Keith snapped his attention back to her. "Airbender Allura claims you are the Avatar?" Keith swallowed and said, "Yes, that's correct." She eyed him distrustfully. "And where have you been for the past 20 years? "Well, it's kind of a long story, but the Fire Nation Royal Council didn't find me when I was a kid, and I only discovered I was the Avatar recently myself," Keith explained. Zonda's eyes narrowed at the mention of the Fire Nation. "What is it that you want from me?" Allura's letter said something about the White Lion. Keith nodded. "I'm helping the Air Nation look for her. I had hoped that if I could meet one of the other lions and maybe keep in physical contact with them while I searched the spirit world, it might enhance our connection." "Why my lion? You are Fire Nation, are you not? Why use the red lion? Why not use the red lion?" Keith grimaced. "We were already here in Ba Sing Se when Allura proposed the idea. Plus, neither of us are really on good terms with the royal family there." "How convenient." She arched an eyebrow. Keith held in a sigh. "Please, if I could just spend even an hour with the green lion, out of the question." "What?" Queen Zonda peered down her nose at him like Keith was a bug under her shoe. "I've always had my suspicion that Zarkon was behind the White Lion's disappearance, and now you are asking me to leave my lion in the care of one of his citizens, alone and unprotected. What kind of a fool do you take me for?" "That's not..." Keith gaped. "I'm not trying to steal the green lion. I just want to..." "I don't care," she interrupted with a curl of her lip. "What happened to the air nomads was a tragedy, but I refuse to risk my nation's own well-being. I won't make any exceptions, not even for the Avatar." Keith scowled, all pretense of politeness forgotten. "So you won't help?" Keith demanded. "The White Lion may belong to the Air Nation, but all the lions are important to the whole world. That makes it your problem, too. What if the others start to go missing? Is that a threat?" Zonda looked livid. "No!" Keith threw his hands up in frustration. "I'm just saying the lions are all connected, and if one disappeared, the others could too. So we should try to figure out what happened and fix it before anything else goes wrong. But if you're so scared that you won't even let your lion out of your sight, get out!" Zonda shouted. "Guards!" The guards The doors burst open and several guards rushed in. Keith wrenched out of their hold and stormed towards the entrance. He didn't stop, even after he passed Alora's wide-eyed stare. "Keith, what happened?" "I'm sorry, Alora," Keith spat out, as the guards escorted them off the grounds. "She refused to help, and I lost my temper. Even if you went back in there to talk to her, I doubt she'd let me interact with the lion." Alora sighed. "It was a long shot anyway," she said. "Come on, let's go back to the inn and think of a new plan." Once they'd returned and told everyone what happened, the group started brainstorming. "I still think we should go to the Northern Air Temple," Alora said. "My father can tell you more about the White Lion, and perhaps you can sense something if you visit the lion's den." "Sure," Keith agreed. "We already talked about going there anyway, but I think you were on the right track about meeting the other lions. Even though we were only in the same room for a few minutes, I felt something from the green lion. I bet if I was able to actually make contact with one, it would lead to some kind of breakthrough." "We could go back to the Fire Nation," Pidge offered wryly. "I know you still got this weird thing with Lotor, but maybe the Fire Lord will be willing to help you out since you're the Avatar." "Yeah, because that worked so well with Queen Sonda," Keith grimaced. "Let's call that our last resort." "Guys!" Lance huffed and crossed his arms. "How are you not seeing the most obvious solution? There's still one other lion. The blue lion, which my great-uncle takes care of. My great-uncle, who I assure you doesn't have a giant stick up his butt like Sana or Zarkon." The rest of the team traded glances. "The North Pole is closer to the Fire Nation," Pidge said. "And the Northern Air Temple is on the way," Laura added. "And Lance can introduce Keith to his family," Hunk grinned teasingly. Lance turned bright red. Conversely, Keith paled in terror. "Hunk!" Lance screeched. "This is serious." "Well, I would hope you guys are serious if you're taking him to meet your parents." "Hunk!" Amidst everyone's laughter and Lance's flailing, a renewed spark of hope grew in Keith's chest.